music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. In the year 2000, President Bill Clinton promised that Chinese attempts at censoring the internet would be just as successful as nailing Jell-O to a wall. But today, China's censorship's efforts are reaching out so far that even on Twitter, a service blocked in China, Chinese nationals are pressured to keep quiet. Just last week, China's control of the internet is reaching out so far that, for instance, at Air Moving Device, an anonymous account with just a few thousand followers filled with interesting data visualizations of party politics, tweeted out that, quote, "I will be deleting all my tweets and no longer be tweeting or responding to DMs. All of my tweets were entirely based on personal analysis using publicly available data and did not involve any other individuals. It is not my intention to subvert state or party authority." So, how did it come to this? To discuss, we're joined today by James Griffiths, author of the recently published The Great Firewall of China, How to Build and Control an Alternative Version of the Internet. James, thanks for coming on China Econ Talk.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
So what brought you to write this book?
What I say when people ask me that question is that I lived in China during what I call kind of the heyday of Weibo and Chinese social media, when there was this real excitement around what the Chinese internet was evolving into, and this feeling that it was potentially evolving into something more free and more transparent, and also something that could hold the government to account in a way that hadn't been done before. You know, in the kind of early days of Weibo as this kind of mass social media platform, you know, you saw things like officials called out for having a watch that was worth several times their salary, or the big one was the high-speed rail crash, which then a lot of people kind of did some citizen reporting into and posted on Weibo, and that you know, that had real effect. And you know, the biggest, I think, real success and the real tangible one that still goes on today is that, you know, a lot of the conversation about air pollution in China today was started on Weibo and was driven by kind of pressure on Weibo. And so there was this real excitement about what the internet was evolving into. And then I witnessed that. And then I also witnessed the kind of unfortunate reality of what it did evolve into, which was something even more controlled and even more cut off from the outside world. And you know, we saw kind of the death of Weibo as a free speech platform. You know, excitement about WeChat didn't really turn into anything in terms of free speech. And as the book kind of recounts, things have basically been, apart from a few kind of vague spikes where it looks like things are getting better for a while, you know, the trend is actually towards more control and, you know, less ability to talk about things online.
So before we come back to the present day, one of the really interesting things your book does is give a real arc in terms of just the kind of overall history of what the internet meant to free speech in China. So let's go back to the very beginning. How did the internet come to China, and what did it look like in those very early years?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty rudimentary. You know, these are it's difficult to remember nowadays what it was like to use. I mean, even actually pretty modern dial-up or you know, non-broadband connections, and this was even more rudimentary than that. But so 1987 is when the first email was sent from China, which is kind of a good you know, marker for when the internet. But I mean, it didn't. You want to tell the
story of what the email said?
So yeah, I mean, the first email was sent by a group of Chinese scientists working with some European colleagues to connect China to the burgeoning global internet. And so in 1987, September 1987, they sent their first email, which said, "Across the Great Wall, we can reach every corner in the world. This is the first electronic mail," because you had to spell it out those days. You couldn't say email. "Supposed to be sent from China into the international scientific networks via computer interconnection." And so from that start, you know, it was a rough start. The actual email didn't send at first. It took a couple of days for it to actually go through and be delivered.
Oh no!
So that was China's first connection to the world. It went to another university in Europe. But you know, even after that, it didn't really take off for a few years. You know, by 1994, there are statistics that show there was still only a few thousand people with access to the internet, and you know, but it didn't become commercially available until kind of the end of that decade. But once it did take off, it really took off. I mean, you know, which is a pattern which is common in most countries. But there was this thing called the Year of the Internet in 1997, where there was this, you know, big craze for it, and it was on, you know, there were kind of adverts for internet services and ISPs on buses and you know, billboards in Beijing, and that's kind of when we really saw this flowering of it. Unfortunately,
and by 1998, you know, the country was over it, I think. Pretty much, right?
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, I mean, the year before the Year of the Internet, the government passed the first regulations to control the internet, and they took a while to get to grips with this technology as well. But once they realized the potential for it, they pretty quickly passed legislation to control it, and it's kind of only been escalating since then.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because 98 is pretty. I'll give the Chinese government credit for kind of understanding that this was a flashpoint. I think a lot of other countries around the world didn't quite see the potential power of the internet at that earliest stage. So what was it you think about the Chinese government's thinking about free speech in general, about the internet in particular, that had their ears, I don't know, maybe perked earlier than other countries might have been?
One of the arguments I make in the book is that the kind of important thing about the internet is not so much its ability to spread content to enable people to learn specific kind of facts. The important thing from a free speech perspective, and especially from a kind of repressive government perspective, is how the internet enables and spreads solidarity. It allows me to connect with a person of a similar political mind, and we can organize online. And I think when you're talking about a government which comes from a mass movement like the Communist Party does, that there is a kind of implicit understanding of that, more so than maybe other governments might have had at the time. This is a government which came to power by a communist revolution, which required massive solidarity and massive kind of spreading of propaganda and of thinking, and uniting people across the whole country. And I think maybe they understood better than others did. Well, if people can use the internet to do that, that can potentially be a threat to us. And also, it is definitely important that it comes within, less than a decade since Tiananmen had happened, and there was this mass movement. And I have a quote in the book from one of the Tiananmen protesters who kind of said, look, if we'd had email at the time of Tiananmen, we could have spread the news about what was happening much quicker. And that might have caused a kind of counter uprising in cities outside of Beijing if people had heard what happened. And, and I think just as they understood that, the government understood that, and they thought, well, we need to control this as soon as possible.
So that's an interesting take, because in some parts of your book, you have people quoted talking to the contrary, basically talking about, in Iran, for instance, how Twitter and Facebook's role were actually overplayed and people had other means of getting in touch with folks. And there's an interesting way to think about this, where if you have everyone so dependent on the internet, then by being able to kind of like control and meld and, potentially pull the plug, you end up having more power to shape a society than you would otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely true. That there are a couple of studies out there that show that people's engagement in activism online can actually sap their willingness to take part in something on the streets, because they feel like they're taking part, even if actually what they're doing is not really affecting things that much. That's where I would maybe kind of draw a distinction between, kind of posting online in support of something which is more like creating content, and organizing online. The important thing is the ability to organize things which then go to the street and which then affect direct action, rather than just complaining about the government or posting calls for things to happen and then not following up on them. Yeah. The Iran example is a really interesting one, because it was kind of like a reverse Potemkin internet protest, in that a lot of media in the West and a lot of politicians in the West saw this thing that had been invented by the West in a way, that it was people talking about these protests on social media, and a lot of people in the Iranian diaspora or just supporters of this kind of action in the West talking about it on Twitter, which made it hugely popular on Twitter. And some of those people were sharing information from within Iran that was sent to them in another way. But the penetration in Iran on Twitter was like minuscule, and there were hardly any users on it. And they were organizing, they were talking about these protests in a completely different way. And the idea that they were driven by Twitter was then kind of first propagated and then kind of exaggerated by people in the West.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothetical whether it's easier to kind of manage and control folks who are organizing online or offline.
Yeah, and but I think it's also important to realize that because of the way that we operate today, doing anything else, I don't think many political parties or activists are particularly capable at organizing without the internet. And that's not suggest that they're missing in skills or anything, but they're it just is such a factor in how we use our lives.
So going back to the 90s and early 2000s, there are a number of Westerners who you profiled that had a outsized impact on the state of the Chinese internet and the creation of the Chinese internet. So you want to talk about a few of these folks who helped connect Dharamsala to the world or helped set up Chinese IT backbone?
Yeah, so kind of one of the really interesting things I found in the reporting of the book is that there's this kind of simultaneous connection of China, of Greater China, to the internet. And then also at the same time, there was these activists, Tibetan and US technologists who were working in Dharamsala, which is where the exiled Tibetan community and the Dalai Lama live. And they were working to connect Dharamsala to the internet. And Dharamsala, as a place in very, very rural India, it was actually connected to the internet incredibly early, while a lot of the country still didn't have internet access. And so, the guy I talk about with Dharamsala is this US technologist called Dan Haig, and he, was part of this team that they went out there, and he had a kind of connection to Tibet through both as a kind of student, and he visited there as a tourist kind of backpacker, and then he realized there was this desire for connections, and there was this very basic line that was set up through an Indian service, and that had this, and they needed to upgrade it, and they flew into Delhi with spools of cable and modems and stuff, and they trekked out to Dharamsala, which it's still fairly out of the way even today. It's a couple of flights, and then there's a bus. This is in the 90s. It was even more difficult. And so they get there, and he told me this great story about that. Actually, one of the most horrific things they found was the Tibetans were fully on board with this, and then the thing that really freaked them out was the kind of Indian health and safety standards at the time. He told the story of they were in the bank and they saw this kind of cable, naked power cable leading out of a bank machine, and then going straight up out of the window and straight into the pylon with no kind of earthing cable or protections on it at all. And this is just freaking these guys out so much. They spend their lives building safe systems. They got Dharamsala connected to the internet very, very early for the type of community it was. And that had a real effect. I mean, I was talking about solidarity, and that, had a real effect in kind of building or not so much in building the Tibetan diaspora up in terms of an activism sense, but in connecting what existed in the West, which was this quite active Tibetan diaspora movement, in terms of activism and campaign on behalf of Tibet. But what was bizarre is they were somewhat disconnected from the actual Tibetan leadership and the government in exile and the Dalai Lama, because they were all in rural Tibet, and it was hugely expensive to call them. It was difficult to send faxes. And so by connecting Dharamsala up to the internet, that really, brought the entire kind of global community together. And so at the same time as this is happening across the Himalayas, you have the kind of burgeoning internet in China, which ironically was also built largely by American technologists and engineers. I mean, Chinese engineers had a huge role in it, but at that time in history, the leading experts in building domestic internets were Americans, And so there was a couple of guys who was working there. Sprint had a big contract at the time, and one of the people I profile is this man called Michael Robinson, who just happened to be living in China at the time. He was teaching, as kind of many Americans have come through China as teachers, and he saw that there were internet accounts being offered that you could go down to the government office and sign up for them. And he went and he signed his school up for it, and he kind of poked around, and he was like, "Oh God, this is set up so terribly." And he just sent off an email to the person at the other end of this ISP and said, you've misconfigured, X system, please change the setting to this, just thinking to get his own internet system to work better. And in the end, he got offered a job because they're like, "Oh my God, we've got a capable, trained internet expert in China. Let's give him a job."
Did he speak Chinese back then?
That's a good question. I don't honestly know. I don't remember asking. I don't think I ever asked him if he spoke Chinese when he first got that job. Okay. Because he was working as an English teacher, so that's not necessary. He won't necessarily have had to have spoken Chinese.
Yeah, I remember. Well, regardless, his IT Chinese was probably not super top notch. Though then again, then again, it's not. These are the sorts of things where actually technical experts can really have an impact through even around technology barrier, even around language barriers, I imagine.
Mm. Yeah, and he was instrumental in working with Sprint at the time to set up these backbones that powered the internet across the country, and then setting a pattern that basically has continued to this day. Really is that Sprint kind of was successful and, was popular with the Chinese government, and they provided these great service. And then quickly they got undercut by a Chinese company and were replaced. And the government was much more happy to have a Chinese company do this job instead.
Sprint. So one of the interesting things in your book is this exploration of how dissident strategies evolved over time. So I learned in particular and thought was interesting the story of Li Hongquan and Da Cancao. So what was going on with him and his internet spam subversive mailing list?
Yeah. I mean, it seems crazy nowadays that you could have a subversive mailing list, let alone in China. So Li Hongquan was a kind of activist. He was involved in the Tiananmen movement, and he was kind of one of many, young idealistic Chinese people who kind of moved overseas following Tiananmen in the 90s. And he kind of found himself in New York, and he got involved with the exiled movement there, started kind of thinking of a way to get information back into China and to spread, news that was being censored, and then also kind of political criticism of the government. He worked with a couple of other groups, and eventually he launched his own, magazine. I guess they would always call it. So Da Cancao, which or in English it was always called VIP reference. Big reference is the literal translation. VIP reference isn't as snappy. But the thing they struck on was that even though a lot of websites were being censored and the Great Firewall really was kind of building up at this time, the technology being used to do it wasn't as sophisticated as what we have today. That there were IP addresses and domain names were blocked, but there wasn't the kind of deep packet inspection, and there wasn't the kind of AI technology in there to really detect content. So they started collecting email addresses. They'd go on university websites, and he was telling me that a lot of universities at the time, you could just go on their server and you could very easily find a database that had every single email address that was on that server. and so they would gather thousands and thousands of emails. And then they would just send this newsletter full of banned news and criticism of the government. They just send it to thousands of people in China, and that was both a strategy in terms of spreading it and getting it as far as possible, but it also gave people plausible deniability that because it was being spammed into everyone's things, and they tell people don't forward this, don't kind of do anything that makes it look like you endorse it. It's just spam, so you read it and then you don't do anything with it.
The kind of idea of this, of all of a sudden, you're some grad student looking up physics papers online, and then this shows up in your inbox, it must have just been a real surprise, shock. I don't know what I would make of it if I was in that mindset at the time. So could you talk a little bit about the impact it had or didn't have?
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays we're kind of so cynical that we wouldn't really be impressed by it, and we probably dismiss it even if it was saying something true.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, Kyrie Irving, I'm sure he got convinced that the Earth is flat from this sort of email address. But shout out to NBA jokes here on China Econ Talk. Anyways, excuse me, James. Please.
So yeah, I mean, the impact of Da Cancao was very big. This wasn't the only service like this, but it was one of the biggest. And you can still find, there are archives of it online, and it was very, very regular, and it was very comprehensive in terms of the type of news that it was sending out about the democracy movement, how it was organizing overseas, stories about kind of victims of Tiananmen and other things that were happening in China at the time. And so I spoke to Michael Anstey, who is more famous today as a dissident writer himself, and has lots of experience with censorship. And he was kind of, as a much younger man, did just receive this random email in his inbox. He lived in Nanjing at the time, and he was interested, politically kind of conscious, but there was a very limited degree to which you could be politically conscious, as a young person living in Nanjing, not even in the capital. And he described it as, really, really eye-opening. And that you used to kind of be really excited when you would see a new copy of Da Cancao in your inbox. And I think it's very, very difficult for us to appreciate today how revelatory that could be. We're living in a society where not only do you not really know dissident thought or criticism of the government, but you don't have that great of an idea of just what the government is doing. The Chinese propaganda system is much, much more sophisticated now, and much more kind of, I wouldn't really use the word transparent,
but more like it's easier to get knowledge. It wasn't. Yeah, it's just the internet. You can, if you want to look up stuff, you can. I mean, right now we have like the propaganda app where you have to log in every day and like see what the Chinese government is doing. So I think it's just it's a different media era, right? And you had radio, you had TV, you had books if you really wanted to read. It's this very sci-fi, this very Black Mirror type story of this kind of like subversive email just sneaking into your inbox unawares.
Yeah, and I mean, there was also, I found a great article from the time as well that quoted this policeman in Shanghai who got it and was incredibly upset by it, and described it as, I think he described it as spiritual pollution, and was really, really offended to get this subversive email in his inbox. Sure. So not everyone was happy, but they did all kind of recognize it, and unfortunately for Li Hongguan and the system, they the censors kind of recognized what it was as well, and started kind of trying to block it. I remember even not that long ago, I mean probably even a decade ago, that spam was still relatively a real problem, and now it isn't. It just goes into a different folder, and you largely don't see it unless you have a kind of really crappy work server that doesn't do it properly. Yeah. And so with the same technology, they started to filter this stuff out, and unfortunately, when you're trying to talk about banned topics, that does give the authorities pretty obvious keywords as to what they're trying to block. And they tried various ways of getting around this. There was they would like break up all of the text so there was only one word on each line and one character on each line, so that there weren't characters together, and then that kind of broke up a lot of maybe the banned words, and try and do it that way. And there was a while when they would be sent out as images, but obviously that this is much earlier internet, so that has its own issues in terms of bandwidth and delivering into people's inboxes. And as you kind of get towards the start of the 2000s, this is becoming much, much less of an effective tactic.
You do say, which I thought was a line I really liked in your book, is that ironically, Chinese is a language perfectly suited to getting around keyword filters, whereas English would soon descend into nonsense by trying to replace words with homonyms. There are thousands of potential Chinese characters to choose from that obscure meaning but preserve the sounds of a word. So, this cat and mouse game, I think, is much more kind of creative and interesting to watch in Mandarin than it would be in English.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? It would just, it would be leet speak, I guess. Replacing letters with numbers if we tried to do it in English. But
you can only go so far. Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, you'd run out so quickly. Yeah. Well, I won't repeat the most famous homonym, most famous substitution on your podcast, but there are lots and lots of substitutions that you can make that people can still kind of get the gist of.
So we're in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Tom Friedman, the much reviled New York Times op-ed writer and big think person, arguably does the greatest thing of his lifetime in confronting Jiang Zemin about the New York Times. So he asked this question to Jiang Zemin, saying like, what's your deal with blocking the New York Times? And Jiang Zemin responds, you raised a very specific issue with the New York Times website in particular, and I cannot answer that question. But if you ask my view of the New York Times, my answer is that it is a very good paper. So what happens after this?
I mean, the New York Times got unblocked.
Unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. I mean, everything about the story is unbelievable. Not only can you imagine the New York Times being allowed to sit down with the Chinese president in this day and age, and be able to ask combative questions. That's unbelievable to begin with. And then him kind of taking them into consideration and then deciding, actually, yeah, we should unblock this paper. I mean, it's crazy. And it just, it does kind of show, it just shows how far we've come since the Jiang Zemin era.
It was totally shocking. And it was clear. I mean, this would not have happened in its own right had this moment not transpired, I'm sure.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm sure some of it was also to show that, I'm sure they were pretty keen for people to actually be able to see the Jiang Zemin interview and see, how important we are on the global stage. But, it was really remarkable.
And so how long did this last? I mean, the New York Times had and still has a fantastic Chinese language website where a ton of articles are translated every day into wonderful Chinese, which is a great learning material if you want English Chinese side by side. But when did the game end for them on the mainland?
Yeah, so it was a New York Times Pulitzer winner, Tom Friedman, who got them unblocked, and then it was a New York Times Pulitzer winner, Dave Barboza, who got them blocked again in 2012 when he wrote about the hidden fortune that the family of Wen Jiabao had, and that other officials had this secret family money that there isn't necessarily a good explanation for.
Not a bad run, I must say, when it comes to the lifespan of these sorts of things.
Yeah, and it often can seem really, really bizarre from the outside what gets you blocked, because there is a sophistication to the firewall. things can be blocked at an individual URL level, so you can block a specific story, and it's very difficult to kind of see into the black box and decide, you see what gets the website blocked, what gets the publication blocked, rather than what gets a specific story blocked. And sometimes the blocks last for a week around a sensitive event, and sometimes they last forever.
Yeah, well, we'll see what this episode does to China Econ Talk, but fingers crossed. So I just spent 2 years at a master's program in China and China studies, and doing it, I watched a lot of iQIYI, but didn't necessarily gain too many hard skills. Had I only known that at the University of San Francisco's new Master in Applied Economics, I could have learned something to actually make me super employable. R, SQL, machine learning, all that good stuff you actually see on job listings in Silicon Valley and Zhongguancun, not necessarily have you watched all of Wanlasong. So in this program, you can study the economics of platforms, auctions, and business strategy at the same time as you learn the tools of econometrics, experimental design, and machine learning. Plus, for all those non-US students out there, this program is designated STEM, so you can apply for a 3-year extension on your student visa and keep working in the US after you graduate. To learn more and get an application fee waiver, go to usfca.edu/Jordan. So you do a very good job of covering the Google arc in China in this book, but I thought what was most interesting to me did the kind of moral calculus, over the different points of the life cycle in Google in China. And we've done a few shows on this in the past, but some of the interesting reporting that you had was Eric Schmidt talking about how, quote, "we did an evil scale and decided not to serve at all was worse evil." And Larry Page saying that nobody actually believes us, but we very strongly made these decisions on what we thought were the best interests of humanity and the Chinese people. So Google has gotten, has received a lot of criticism over the past 15, 20 years for their engagement and, desire to work and really succeed in the Chinese market, with Congress people in 2006 comparing what they're doing to IBM working in Nazi Germany. But I'm curious, to what extent do you think this criticism is fair, justified, and how much kind of moral responsibility you put on these American tech companies when working in the Chinese market? Yeah,
I mean, well, the first thing I would say is that, it's very convenient that the thing that happens to be the most ethical is also the thing that benefits Google's bottom line. But, it's an interesting topic. I think, with the recent reporting about Google, I mean, the fantastic reporting that The Intercept and Ryan Gallagher did about Dragonfly, and, the kind of pressure on that seems to have, killed that project. You did see a lot of people talking about, why are you doing this? Aren't Chinese people better off to have Google, to even have a censored search engine? And, why are we depriving Chinese people of this, this tool that most other people in the world use every day? And there's a reason for that. And some of that is due to the failures of Chinese search engines and Chinese domestic competitors, that people are just desperate for any other search engine. I think there is a degree to which that criticism has merit. If the argument was, should Chinese people have a better search engine? I think everyone agrees that they should. The kind of difficulty is that when companies make these compromises in China, it doesn't just affect China. Google admitted when they pulled out of the country the first time round, their presence in China was being used against them by other countries as a reason to say, do these kind of things for us. Russia is the kind of the next obvious example, because it's such a big market that they are able to kind of wield that influence as well. But even smaller countries were starting to say, and I'm sure would, if Dragonfly had gone ahead, they would have said, you build a Chinese app, you can build a Russian app, you can build a Ugandan app. The compromises that are made to work in China don't remain in China, and that's kind of the biggest problem.
My worry, concern, resignation is that the cat is sort of out of the bag with this one, and it's hard to. I mean, I don't know. I feel like governments understand that this is something they can do, and they have enough leverage now to. Or enough technical sophistication to shut off companies' access to their market. So it's kind of tricky trying to think of what cards these companies or the U.S. government or just Western governments that value free speech higher really have to play when it comes to persuading and pushing these countries to have more open, freer technology ecosystems.
Yeah, and there's definitely been a trend. Kind of one of the big arguments in the book is that the Great Firewall, just simply by existing, kind of has an effect on global internet policy, because it just shows that there is this other way of doing it. and the kind of compromises that Google made in the 2000s, and other internet companies have made since. That Apple's a big example in terms of kind of localizing servers in China. That has an effect on policy in other countries. And I won't deny that I don't have a great answer for what can be done about it. But I feel quite strongly that you don't improve the situation in one country by potentially making it worse in a bunch of other countries. And it's kind of like we need to build a better internet everywhere, not kind of bring And the risk is that by making these compromises, you actually bring the kind of global internet freedom level, kind of you bring it downwards towards the Chinese model.
Yeah. What also is I find interesting is one of the side effects of this content censorship and these aggressive takes that the Chinese government has taken against the Facebooks and Twitters and YouTubes of the world is this massive flowering of an entire giant, really powerful, impressive Chinese technology ecosystem, which you could argue, I think some of these companies would have existed on their own, but there are others that may have just been wiped away and Instagram and Twitter would be 20, 30, 40% bigger. This is something that's also happened in Russia, where you see these apps, where you see a lot of native apps that have been able to grow up because of the sort of restrictions around a lot of the Western content. So I think just from a kind of domestic growth business perspective, there's always flip sides when it comes to protectionism. On the one hand, you may not be getting world-class stuff to begin with, but you're also giving your domestic entrepreneurs more room to breathe, to kind of find their own footing and develop domestic industry. So I think that is also potentially a big demonstrative effect around the world, is drawing lines around these industries from a content perspective will end up creating a lot more local companies and high-tech stuff, which countries around the world want to see in their economies.
There's a big difference between censoring content and being anti-monopoly. I think there are there are a lot of problems with the current model of kind of surveillance capitalism and the model that the tech giants have kind of thrived in, and it would be interesting to kind of see, and there are some moves towards this in Europe, perhaps, that towards kind of trying to force these companies to reinvent themselves and to kind of allow more competition. There are a few people in China who are happy that Baidu hasn't had to compete with anyone for a long time.
Fair. One great moment in your book was after Google gets shuts down, some executive buys everyone tickets to Avatar and tells them to take the afternoon off. So whenever you run into problems, seeing James Cameron blockbusters is probably the right way to blow off some steam, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I would describe it as salt in the wound, but
Well, I don't know. What would you rather have them seen? What's the appropriate movie to see in that context? What would you have put on the what would you have put on the screen there?
No, I guess I would have to look at exactly what was showing. Well, I mean, it's China, so there was probably like three Hollywood movies showing at the time.
No.
So,
you can pick any movie from history. What's the apropos one there?
What is the apropos one? God, I don't know.
I feel like
Office Space, probably.
Office Space. There we go. The Office Space retro viewing in 2010 for Kai Fu Lee and friends to all watch together. So towards the end of the book, you talk about how the Chinese model of internet regulation is being exported abroad. So give us a little story about how this has played out in Russia in particular.
Yeah, I mean, Russia has always been an interesting case on the internet. In the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was remarkably free, even as there were restrictions, in Russia on kind of TV networks and newspapers faced a lot of pressure. There was this kind of, and it's difficult to tell if it was tolerance or if it was ignorance about how the internet was working and what people were doing online. But there was quite a lot of dissident discussion on the internet and criticism of the government and even kind of organizing political parties and kind of talking about corruption and things like that. And just within the past couple of years, that has completely transformed. It has been a gradual process, but the last couple of years has seen a real escalation. And, even this week, the Russian Duma did the second reading of a couple of new bills that one of which is kind of an anti-fake news law, which imposes fines and potential prison time on people who share fake news content, which is, as you would expect, an incredibly broadly defined term. And then also another piece of law which passed this week was about insulting the government or government officials, including President Putin. And so, Russia is very, very far along in the process of turning into another Chinese internet, basically. So to kind of explain how Russia's transformed, the way the internet works is from a real kind of technical perspective. You have certain access points where the global internet becomes, whichever country's internet. And in a lot of countries, there are many access points, and they may be privately controlled or somewhat government controlled, or mix of both. And in China, obviously, they're government controlled and they're very tightly controlled. And Russia has moved to take much greater control of how the internet comes into the country, and then also to enable it to, in times of conflict, it says to be able to cut them off, to essentially just cut RUNet off from the rest of the global internet, and it will become this kind of intranet for a certain period. That basically is how the Great Firewall works, and that has been done with the assistance of Chinese officials. Chinese officials have been going to Russia for a number of years now in order to consult on this. There are lots of Russian lawmakers kind of on the more conservative side who openly talk about the need to follow the Chinese model, and they give examples of kind of obscene content being spread online, or terrorist content, and they will say, look, we need to learn from China on this and block it entirely.
The lesson is basically a positive one. I mean, when trying to come up with negative things for the party on the internet regulation, you don't really have it. Let's rephrase. If I'm sitting in the Kremlin, this sounds like a great model to me. There's really a it really does sound like a shining model if your incentives are, if you're on the autocratic side and you aren't necessarily comfortable with people speaking out. I think the Chinese regulation and the Chinese internet over the past 20 years has basically been this story of being able to sort of cradle both innovation and business growth, while at the same time keeping free speech to a lid. And I guess the argument that Bill Clinton would have made 20 years ago is that that's basically impossible, and you can't really have one without the other. But history has shown over the past 20 years that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and I think it's an attractive model. It's definitely attractive in autocracies, and but it's an attractive model well beyond that. There are plenty of politicians in perfectly democratic countries who occasionally, reference the Great Firewall and reference China as
we're just regulating fake news. It's just fake news. It's just fake news we're shutting down, of course.
Yeah, it's fake news.
Who wouldn't want to shut down fake news?
Yeah, or it's terrorists. It's terrorists organizing on this encrypted messaging platform, which we obviously then need to access in order to stop this. And, unfortunately, part of, living in a democracy and, promoting free speech is that you kind of have to tolerate a great deal of stuff that you don't like, and China doesn't, and there's a lot of people who are jealous about that.
So aside from reading The Great Firewall of China, James, have you come across Nothing is True and Everything is Possible?
I have, yeah. I read it a number of years ago, so I haven't. I didn't have a super great.
Anyways, but just a recommendation for the listeners out there. It's this fascinating view of how the Russian media landscape. It's written by this British guy who is ethnically Russian and moved to Russia and kind of worked in the media news industry for, I think, like 10 years or something, and talking about sort of like truthiness in the Russian context and allowing a little more speech than I think is necessarily permitted in China, and more kind of like liberal activists, but they're all sort of like pawns and tied into the system. It's this fascinating kind of alternate reality of what the Chinese media landscape could have looked like had, I think there'd been more power centers. I'm not sure why Russia evolved in a different way. I mean, obviously, like the Soviet Union fell, and there's some the rise of autocracy is back in Russia, but it's a really interesting contrast between what you see in the Chinese media landscape and the Russian one. So recommend folks to check that one out.
One of the kind of, just from a observing propaganda perspective, one of the interesting things over the years has been China's struggle to make propaganda that anyone wants to I won't speak for everyone in China, but certainly that anyone outside of China wants to consume. That they've really struggled with it compared to Russia. Puts out some pretty entertaining things. I'd much rather watch Russian state TV than watch Chinese state TV every day.
Sure. Yeah, no, they definitely seem like a lot looser, a lot, no holds barred, anything goes, funnier for sure. Better with the getting under foreigners' skin, I think. And the Russia Today and propaganda influence in European politics in particular, but also to a certain extent in the U.S., I think has been much more successful than what China has been able to pull off over the past 10 years or so, for sure. What do you think you can chalk that up to?
One of the things that the party has shown over and over again is that it cannot give up control. It gets really freaked out whenever there's kind of something that is, outside of the party system and is outside of, the direct control, of a party official. We've seen that with kind of, the resurgence of party committees inside business, or, with kind of even things like the women's movement, which is arguably a very, very positive thing from a, purely kind of objective Chinese societal perspective, conforms with a lot of, values that the Communist Party claims to uphold. And
Li Keqiang talking about it this week. Yeah, sure.
It's that inability to kind of loosen, to let go of something, which then prevents. People need space. People need space to create interesting culture, and even if that culture is kind of promoting the party in the end, and or criticizing opposing governments, people need a certain degree of freedom to do that, and you can't kind of you can't do that by committee, I would say.
Yeah, I mean the best propagandists are the ones that have some flair, and I don't think flair is a thing. Coming back to Office Space, because that was a good callback. Is something that the Xinhua News and the People's Daily do all that well. So to end our discussion, I'd like to come back to the start of your book, the story of 2015 and what happened with GitHub. So could you tell us that story?
Yeah. So at the time, GitHub was kind of, it was hosting a couple of projects. One of them was run by greatfire.org, and there was also a kind of mirrored version of the New York Times Chinese site, which was hosted on GitHub. And this was kind of a way to kind of get around the Great Firewall, and also kind of provide an alternative way of getting in. And, you had various apps that would help you subvert the firewall, which are hosted on GitHub. And then all of a sudden in 2015, there was GitHub went down, which is not really it's not a thing that is supposed to happen, because GitHub's a very, very important thing in terms of software development. And it went down, and it stayed down for quite a long time. And they revealed kind of very little at the beginning. They just said, we're getting hit with a distributed denial of service attack. And then, as it stayed down, and as various other people tried to kind of assist, it just became clear just how big of an attack this was. And eventually some technologists and experts in this field, looked at this attack and were able to trace it back to the infrastructure, which we know is part of the Great Firewall, and that they nicknamed the attack the Great Cannon. And to describe it in a very, very simplified way, but it took a bunch of traffic, which was supposed to be going as it went across the firewall, and just redirected it at GitHub. So a traditional distributed denial of service attack works by getting a bunch of kind of, you've hacked a load of computers, and you point them at a server and you try and crash it. And China didn't even need to do the hacking, because it has all of this traffic that it can control to begin with. And it just pointed them all at GitHub and just hit them repeatedly. And it was very, very effective in terms of getting GitHub down. It arguably did not achieve its goal of kind of removing this thing, because GitHub was very kind of clear about not wanting to delete this content, but it certainly sent a message, and it did a lot of damage to greatfire.org's servers, and they were lucky that I think in the end it didn't cost them the money it should have done, because their hosting providers were generous, but it could have cost them a lot of money. What I see that as, and the reason I decided to focus on it, especially at the beginning of the book, is that I see that as something of a turning point. You talked at the beginning of the podcast about this recent kind of trend of Chinese activists and even just Chinese people on Twitter suddenly disappearing and or shutting their accounts because they're getting pressure from China or from within the country, or they're just worried about seeing other people get pressure, and that these spaces where speech or criticism is tolerated are growing ever smaller. And I see the attack on GitHub as kind of a turning point of how we got there. That in the past, the censors used to be much more focused on what happened within China, and in recent years they've fixed the problem in China, as it were, and they've started paying much more attention to what's happening overseas. And we saw that both with GitHub, with a lot of hacking which has been tied to Chinese state actors, with this recent kind of purge almost of Chinese Twitter users, and then also with things like the pressure on airlines to stop referring to Taiwan as a country, or
Sure.
And other things like that. That this Chinese-style political correctness, for lack of a better term, is spreading beyond the firewall.
James, thanks for being a part of China Econ Talk.
Thank you.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.
X 换来换去怎么办？一选择头疼，这里好心情，在台上有梦，女王的心意，耀眼的星星，时尚的精英，搭配什么看我的心情，你可以亲吻我的。